For 600 years, one family sat on a throne that touched 3 continents. 30 sultans. An empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. And then, in the space of about 18 months, almost all of it was gone. The throne, the title, the palaces, even their own names. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. Their fall didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened quietly before dawn on trains and warships, with almost no one watching. And for some of them, it wasn't even close to over. Not for another 50 years. I want to walk you through what actually happened to the Ottoman dynasty after their empire collapsed, because the story most people know stops at the history textbook version. Empire falls, republic rises, the end. What actually happened to the family is a completely different story. And it's one of the strangest, saddest chapters in modern royal history. To understand how it ended, you have to go back a little further, because the Ottoman collapse wasn't a single event. It was a long, slow bleed. By the middle of the 1800s, European diplomats had already started calling the empire the sick man of Europe. Territory kept slipping away. Russia pushed in the north. France, Algeria. Greece won its independence, then Serbia, then Romania, then Bulgaria. The sultans tried to modernize. The Tanzimat reforms rebuilt the legal system and the military on paper. But reform can only outrun collapse for so long. Then came 1908, and a group calling themselves the Committee of Union and Progress forced a constitutional revolution. A year later, they deposed the reigning sultan and installed his brother as a mostly ceremonial figure instead. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 stripped away nearly all of the empire's remaining territory in Europe. And then, in 1914, the empire's rulers made the single most consequential decision in its final century. They entered World War I on the side of Germany, betting that a Central Powers victory would restore Ottoman prestige. It was a catastrophic gamble. British forces swept through Mesopotamia and Palestine. The Arab Revolt, backed by British intelligence, peeled away Ottoman control of the Arabian Peninsula. By October 1918, the war was lost, and the empire signed an armistice that handed its military capacity to the Allied powers. Allied troops occupied Istanbul itself, British, French, and Italian soldiers patrolling streets that had belonged to the Ottomans for nearly 5 centuries. Into that vacuum stepped a general named Mustafa Kemal. While the Sultan in Istanbul negotiated with the occupying powers, Kemal was in Anatolia organizing what would become the Turkish War of Independence, rejecting the harsh peace terms the Allies had drawn up at Sèvres in 1920, terms that would have carved up Anatolia itself. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the man still sitting on the throne. He'd cooperated with the occupation. He'd sent troops against Kemal's nationalists. So when Kemal's forces started winning, the Sultan wasn't just a defeated monarch. He was, in the eyes of the new nationalist government, something closer to a collaborator. On November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate outright. Some deputies hesitated. This was, after all, a 6-century-old institution they were voting to end. Kemal made it clear there was nothing to debate. Sultan Mehmed VI now found himself in real danger, and this is where the human story actually starts. In the early hours of November 17, 1922, he was driven through Istanbul in British military ambulances, alongside his 10-year-old son, Prince Mehmed Ertugrul. British General Charles Harrington personally escorted him to the harbor and put him aboard the battleship HMS Malaya. As the ship pulled away, the man who had inherited the title of 36th Ottoman Sultan looked back at a city his family had ruled for over 4.5 centuries. He would never see it again. He first went to Malta, then briefly toward Mecca, and eventually settled on the Italian Riviera, in the town of San Remo. And this is where the myth of the fabulously wealthy, deposed monarch falls apart completely. Ottoman sultans didn't have personal fortunes the way European kings did. The treasury belonged to the state, and the state no longer existed for him. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy reportedly offered him a palace and a steady income. He turned it down. As a religious leader, accepting charity from a non-Muslim sovereign was, to him, a compromise he wasn't willing to make. He chose to live modestly instead, spending his final years writing memoirs and making increasingly futile appeals to reclaim his throne. On May 16, 1926, Mehmed VI died in that borrowed Italian villa. He was 65. His body was eventually buried at a mosque complex in Damascus, nowhere near the imperial tombs where his ancestors lay. Now, if the story ended there, it would already be a fairly dramatic fall from grace. But it doesn't there. Because 2 days after Mehmed VI fled Istanbul, his cousin Abdülmecid was appointed to a role that still existed, at least on paper. Caliph, the spiritual head of the Sunni Muslim world. He had no political power whatsoever. He was a genuinely cultured man, a painter whose work had been exhibited in Vienna, a pianist fluent in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, French, German, and English. And for about 16 months, he held weekly public processions in Istanbul, greeting crowds the faithful with real dignity. But those crowds were thinning fast. By late February 1924, more American tourists reportedly showed up to one of his Friday processions than actual worshippers. He kept up appearances anyway. Privately, though, he had to know his position was crumbling, because Kemal had no patience left for any competing source of authority, religious, symbolic, or otherwise. When Abdülmecid wrote asking for a modest increase to his allowance, Kemal's government dismissed his office as an outdated relic with no real reason to exist. On March 3, 1924, after a debate that reportedly ran more than 7 hours, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Caliphate entirely. And this time, they didn't stop at the Caliph. The law stripped every single member of the Ottoman dynasty of Turkish citizenship, confiscated their property, and ordered their permanent expulsion from the country. They were technically given a small window to prepare. Abdülmecid didn't get it. Accounts describe him and his household being rushed out of Istanbul within roughly 24 hours, before the law had even formally taken effect. Fearing public demonstrations, officials avoided the main train station, Çerkesi, and instead put the Caliph's train through a smaller station at Catalca. The last person in the country to show him any formal respect, according to accounts of that morning, was the station's Jewish director. So what did that law actually mean for the family as a whole? Officially, 156 people were named for expulsion. But once you count the relatives who left voluntarily rather than be separated, and the servants who refused to abandon the households they'd served their whole lives, most accounts put the real number in the hundreds. These were people raised entirely inside the walls of Ottoman palaces, trained in poetry, calligraphy, music, protocol, and in the men's case, sometimes military command. Almost none of them had a marketable skill for the world they were about to be dropped into. And here's the detail that makes it worse. Most of them didn't pack up their whole lives, because they genuinely believed this was temporary. Surely, they told themselves, this would blow over. It didn't blow over. It lasted depending on whether you were a woman or a man in the family, either 30 years or 50. So let me tell you about a few of the people who actually lived through it, because the scale of 156 exiled royals doesn't mean much until you hear what it looked like for individuals. Start with Duruzvar Sultan, the Caliph's own daughter. She was around 10 years old when her family was forced out of Turkey in 1924, and they settled like a huge number of exiles did in Nice on the French Riviera. Her father's money ran out fairly quickly in exile, and for a while the family survived on assistance from an Egyptian prince, and then from Mir Osman Ali Khan, the Nizam of Hyderabad, at the time reportedly one of the richest men on earth. In November 1931, when Duruzvar was 17, she married the Nizam's eldest son in a wedding held in Nice. It wasn't purely romantic. It was, by most accounts, a calculated alliance that finally gave her father some financial stability after years of scraping by. She became Princess of Berar and moved to India, while her father stayed behind in France, painting, playing piano, and attending Friday prayers at the Grand Mosque of Paris. He died there of a heart attack on August 23, 1944. His family wanted to bury him in Istanbul. The Turkish government said no. His body sat in a Paris mortuary for close to a decade before he was finally laid to rest in Medina, in Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of the institution he'd once, at least in name, led. Then there's Neslisa Sultan, and her story might be the most remarkable of all of them, because she got exiled twice from two different thrones. She was born in February 1921, the granddaughter of both Mehmed VI and Abdülmecid, and her birth was the last one formally recorded in the Ottoman Palace Registry before the whole system was dismantled. She was 3 years old when her family was expelled in 1924. She grew up in Nice, moved to Egypt as a young woman, and in 1940 married Prince Abdelmonem, son of the last Khedive of Egypt. When Egypt's monarchy briefly restructured itself in 1952, her husband became regent, and she effectively became First Lady of Egypt. And then, that same year, Gamal Abdel Nasser's revolution swept away the Egyptian monarchy too. Twice in one lifetime, Neslisa watched a royal house she belonged to get erased by a republic. She didn't reclaim Turkish citizenship until 1963. She died in Istanbul in April 2012 at 91, the last living person whose birth had been recorded in that imperial registry. And then there's a story that reads less like palace drama and more like a Cold War thriller. Except it happened in the 1930s. Sultan Mehmed Abdülkarim was a grandson of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. In the early 1930s, Japanese Pan-Asianist groups looking for a symbolic figurehead to legitimize a puppet state in East Turkestan, what's now Xinjiang in western China, reportedly courted him as a potential ruler, hoping his Ottoman royal lineage would carry weight with local Turkic Muslim populations. The scheme collapsed. Abandoned by his Japanese backers, he fled first to India, then to the United States, nearly broke. On August 3, 1935, he was found dead in a New York hotel room, the death officially recorded as a suicide. His family always suspected something darker, that it was retaliation dressed up to look self-inflicted. We can't settle that question here. What we do know is that his sons, Dündar and Harun, grew up fatherless in exile and would each decades later end up as head of the entire Ottoman family. Beyond these individual stories, the broader picture for the exiled dynasty was brutal in a more mundane, grinding way. Most of them held Turkish travel documents that expired after a single year, and as stateless former citizens, couldn't be renewed. By around 1925, much of the family was effectively trapped wherever they happened to be living, unable to travel and unable to legally work in most countries. It eventually took a member of the family, Prince Ali Vaisib, appealing directly to the French government to secure courtesy passports, though full citizenship was never granted. Accounts from the period describe women who had never handled money or done a single day of domestic labor now taking whatever work they could find. Often the family's last remaining asset, sold off piece by piece, frequently for far less than it was worth, because buyers knew exactly how desperate the sellers were. And through all of it, the Turkish government kept watching. When family members married foreigners, Ankara took notice. When a handful of exiles tried to launch anti-Turkish newspapers from Greece, Turkish pressure reportedly got those publications shut down. Europe in the 20s and 30s, meanwhile, had its own catastrophes to deal with. Economic collapse, the rise of fascism, and had little sympathy to spare for a deposed Muslim dynasty. Occasional newspaper stories treated the fallen family as a curiosity. Sympathy rarely turned to real help. So, when did it actually end? The answer splits right down gender lines, and it's a strange, almost bureaucratic kind of ending after such a dramatic beginning. In 1952, under the government of Adnan Menderes, Turkey allowed the female members of the dynasty back into the country. The men had to wait until 1974, 50 years after the original expulsion, under a general amnesty passed during Bülent Ecevit's time as prime minister. By then, most of the people who'd actually lived through 1924 were dead. The men who did come back were largely the sons and grandsons of the original exiles, people who'd been born abroad and built entire lives somewhere else. Many chose not return at all. What was there to go back to? Their palaces were gone, turned into museums and government buildings. Their social position was gone. And Turkey itself had spent half a century defining its national identity in direct opposition to everything the Ottoman past represented. Not everyone even got the chance to choose. Sesad Dundar Abdulkarim, born in Damascus in 1930 to that prince who died in the New York hotel room, spent his entire life in Syria. When the amnesty came in 1974, he stayed. Decades later, when Syria's civil war broke out, he was still there, elderly, and by most accounts unwell, in a country falling apart around him. Relatives in Turkey tried repeatedly to get him out. They couldn't manage it. He died in Damascus in January 2021, at 90 years old, having never once set foot in the homeland his family had ruled for 6 centuries. His younger brother, Harun Osman, who had returned to Istanbul back in 1974, became head of the family in his place, and he still lives there today. The family that eventually settled or resettled in Turkey took on a shared surname required by the new republic. Osmanoglu, son of Osman after the dynasty's 14th century founder. Today, the Osmanoglu family numbers several dozen living descendants, scattered across Turkey, Europe, the Middle East, and the United States, working in business, academia, and the arts, with essentially no political relevance whatsoever. Now zoom out for a second, because it wasn't just a family tragedy. It reshaped the region in ways that are still playing out. When the Ottoman Empire fell, European powers redrew the map of the Middle East largely to suit themselves, and the borders they drew, often with little regard for the people actually living inside them, are still tangled up in conflicts today. And the abolition of the Caliphate itself left something arguably even bigger unresolved. For 13 centuries, in one form or another, there had been an institution claiming spiritual leadership over the Muslim world. When Kemal ended it in 1924, that vacuum never got filled. The idea of restoring a caliphate has resurfaced periodically ever since, sometimes as scholarly debate, and in more recent decades, as the rallying language of extremist groups like ISIS, groups that invoked the old institution's name while bearing no resemblance to what it once was. Turkish attitudes toward all of this have shifted dramatically over the past century. For decades, the Republic treated the Ottoman era as an embarrassment, a backward, decadent monarchy that modern Turkey had rightly left behind. Ottoman history got downplayed in classrooms, but in recent decades, that's flipped. Turkish television dramas set in the Ottoman era have become massive regional and even global hits. Ottoman imagery has become a genuine source of national pride rather than shame in much of Turkish political and popular culture. And the Osmanoglu family has gone persona non grata to occasional cultural curiosity, invited to documentaries, treated with a kind of cautious fascination. They have no throne to reclaim and no political power. They're just people with an extraordinary surname, living ordinary lives in a country their ancestors once ruled absolutely, and were then violently unwelcome in for half a century. What strikes me most, honestly, isn't the scale of what they lost: palaces, titles, an empire spanning 3 continents. It's the smaller, stranger details. A sultan who chose poverty over accepting a foreign king's charity. A princess exiled from 2 thrones in one lifetime. A prince who died fatherless in Damascus, waiting 50 years for a homecoming that a civil war finally made impossible. Power, it turns out, can be stripped away far more completely and far more slowly than most people ever imagine. So here's what I keep coming back to. If you'd been born into that family, trained your entire life for a role that got legislated out of existence overnight, do you think you'd have chosen to go back to Turkey the moment they let you? Or would you have stayed wherever you'd finally managed to rebuild a life? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the stories history textbooks skip over, get subscribed. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing.